Well, hiya, BookTube. Bill Ruttenberg here with the Ruttenberg Library. I wanted to come to you today with a book chat, and I wanted to talk about a book that I read a couple of weeks ago, and this was Eisenhower and Berlin, 1945, The Decision to Halt at the Elbe, and it's by Stephen Ambrose, and this is a nice, very slim volume. It's actually probably more of an extended essay, or you could probably say each chapter is an essay, and there's about 5 chapters in it. The book's only about 98 pages long as far as text goes, and then when you add in the appendix in the index, it runs about 119 pages. So it's really short, can be read in one afternoon, pretty easy. I think I read it over a couple of afternoons, but super short. Definitely helped me in my understanding at the end of World War II, what was going on politically and militarily. I found it very interesting. And if you've ever had that question, why didn't the United States just roll on into Berlin and prevent the Cold War from ever happening? That's what he answers in this. He goes through several different points. Now, if you know Ambrose, he is an Eisenhower fan, and so it is definitely from a pro-Eisenhower point of view, but I think he does a very nice job breaking things down and explaining his points of view. This book comes from W.W. Norton and Company out of New York, and it was, let's see here, published in 2000. This version is published in 2000. It's an older book, though. It's got several places where it was published before this, but this edition is 2000. So anyway, read this, really enjoyed it. Would recommend World War II buffs to take a read or have a read here. And as I talk about this, please keep in mind that this is not necessarily my wheelhouse. I am still building knowledge in World War II. I tend to read earlier American history. But anyway, the main ideas in this was, again, could the United States or Britain, the Allied powers, could they have taken Berlin before the Russians moved in? And so this goes through that whole thing. Again, it's got 5 chapters. Let me read your chapter titles off to you, and you'll kind of get an idea here. So the first chapter deals with the position. So where were everybody? Where were the different countries? The United States, the British. It talks a little bit about the French, but it's mainly United States and British and the Soviets, and then the Germans on March 7th, 1945. What positions were we in right there at the end of the war? And that's the whole first chapter. Second chapter deals with a lot of the politics, the creation of the zones, because as you know, Germany ends up getting split into four different zones, occupation zones. Third chapter is Eisenhower's superiors and his telegram to Stalin. And so a lot of this deals with just the chain of command, who is in charge in each of the countries in the decision-making process. And if you're going to communicate from country to country, how does that have to be done? Number 4, the military situation and the basis for decision. So, just looking at, this book's going to look at it from the political decisions that were being made and the military decisions that were being made, and really the struggle between the politics and the political stuff and the military stuff. There was a bit of struggle in who is in charge here. And I enjoyed reading that because before this, I really didn't understand a lot of it just because I haven't read a lot of stuff in this area. And then the last chapter is just plain and simple, could Eisenhower have taken Berlin? So again, like we said, as it looks at that big situation as we get into the end of the war, what we find is the British and Americans were sitting about 250 miles from Berlin, and they were still in the process of gathering their armies. And we see them in a situation where they don't know whether to make the main attack from the north or from central south Germany. Where's that main push going to come from? And so we see a a struggle between the United States and Britain politically in how are we going to do that. And we also see a struggle militarily between just the egos of the generals within the United States. And of course, or the United States and Britain. So, you know, it talks a lot about Bernard Montgomery of the British, and it talks about Omar Bradley for the United States. And then, of course, we can't forget George Patton and, you know, just some of the other players in these main movements. And so we see us about the Allied powers in the West, about 250 miles from Berlin. And then in the East, we see the Soviet Union about 35 miles from Berlin, and they've already got 1,250,000 soldiers all built up surrounding Berlin, and about 22,000 guns all built up. At least that's one of the chapters, what it was talking about. I hope that's the total overall numbers, but they were at an advantage when you look at, you know, just distance from the city. But in the book, Ambrose also talks about how the Germans had their main defenses on the eastern side of the city facing the Soviet Union. So even though they were only 35 miles, that distance was going to be a slow go because they were battling the last-ditch effort of the Germans at that point, whereas the United States and the British, when we roll across Western Germany, it was going to things were going to move a lot faster just simply because there wasn't enough defenses. The Germans were, they had brought their forces in, and they just couldn't put up enough of a defense. As we get into, you know, these different chapters in the book, it starts looking at that decision making of Eisenhower, and one of the things, or a couple of the things he was looking at is, you know, distance of the armies, the speed that those armies could move. What were the expected casualties? Because as a overall commander, you've got to look at that, because you've got to face the parents, you know, and the wives and stuff like that back home. You've got to face them and tell them that this decision was the right decision. And he was looking at what his people told him were expectations of 100,000 dead in order to take Berlin. And of course, the Soviet Union's going to be looking at the same thing, maybe more, because the defense is on that side of the city facing them. And, you know, we had already made political agreements before this that the Soviet Union was going to take control of the city of Berlin, okay? And so Eisenhower in his decision-making is going to be looking at, so is it worth losing 100,000 men to invade the city, take control of the city, to turn around and have to give it right back to the Russians or the Soviets? Is that worth it? And that was really the big decision, you know, the big part of that decision. Is it worth it? Could we have taken it? There's an argument that possibly we could have taken it. But was it worth it? Was it going to be worth those losses? And I thought it was really interesting. I'm going to read just a couple of pages out of here to you. Give me just a second to find them. So I'm reading from page 89, and this is from that fifth, all of these things I'm reading are going to be from that 5th chapter. And it says, at the end of March, Eisenhower discussed with Bradley his alternatives. Bradley pointed out that even if the 21st Army Group reached the Elbe before Zhukov crossed the Oder, 50 miles of lowlands separated the Elbe from Berlin. Montgomery would have to advance through an area studded with lakes, crisscrossed with streams, and interlaced with occasional canals. Eisenhower asked Bradley for an estimate on the cost of taking Berlin. About 100,000 casualties, Bradley replied. Bradley replied, a pretty stiff price to pay for prestige objective, especially when we've got to fall back and let the other fella take over. Later after the war, Bradley succumbed to the myth that the British had displayed remarkable political skill while the Americans demonstrated an amazing lack of sophistication. I could see no political advantage in the capture of Berlin that would have offset the need for quick destruction of the German army on our front, he wrote. Then he added what has become perhaps the most quoted sentence of the whole the whole Berlin story. As soldiers, we looked naively on this British inclination to complicate the war with political foresight and non-military objectives. And so, you know, we see it's just a battle back and forth between politics and military. And in war, which one do you listen to? And Eisenhower, of course, is hoping that they will listen to him because, militarily, it's not worth those losses. Moving forward here, let me flip a couple pages forward. But within the American Army, you also have to understand that there was an argument to go take Berlin. So not only is he dealing with political stuff, Eisenhower, he's also dealing with arguments with his generals. And I think what the generals failed to see was the big picture. The generals are seeing their localized situation, but Eisenhower's really has to look at the big picture and what this means overall. And it says, and this is talking about, what is his first name? I got to find his first name. General William Simpson's Ninth Army. So that's what this is referring to. It says, Simpson, bitterly disappointed, fought his emotions, finally gave in and issued the necessary orders. Nothing ever shook him from the belief that the only thing standing between the Ninth Army and Berlin was a wide-open Autobahn. That and something else. In the words of a military writer who agrees with Simpson, there was nothing between him and Hitler except Eisenhower. And so, you do see two sides to this argument. And like I said, though, obviously Ambrose, he's trying to present some of the other side, but he is very pro-Eisenhower. I'll skip ahead here to page 97, something I wanted to point out. This is Eisenhower as he's looking at the situation of these two armies. It says, did it matter? In the long run, certainly not. In the short run, probably not. Still, those who feel that Simpson or Montgomery could have made it contend that it made a monumentous difference. George Patton expressed this view as well as anyone. On the day Simpson reached the Elbe, April 11th, Eisenhower had dinner with Patton. Afterwards, when they were alone, Eisenhower told Patton of his plans to clean up his flanks. From a tactical point of view, Eisenhower added, it is highly inadvisable for the American Army to take Berlin, and I hope political influence won't cause me to take the city. It has no tactical or strategic value and would place upon the American forces the burden of caring for thousands and thousands of Germans, displaced persons, and Allied prisoners of war. And then, let's see, Ike, I don't see how you figure that out, Patton ordered, or replied. We had better take Berlin, and quick, and on to the Oder. Later at his headquarters, Patton again urged Eisenhower to try for Berlin. He said Simpson could take the city in 48 hours. Well, Eisenhower asked, who would want it? And again, he's looking at, with taking the city, look at all the other stuff that you're going to have to take on. And he just did not view it as, that they needed to do that. And then the last part I want to read to you here is at the very end, page 98. It says, by battering their way into Berlin, the Russians suffered heavy casualties. The exact number is in dispute. It was probably in excess of 100,000 of the 100,000 Bradley feared. 2 months later, they gave up to the west over half the city they had captured at such an enormous price. At the cost of not a single life, Great Britain and the United States had their sectors in Berlin. They have been there ever since. Anyway, I just thought this was, I would like to recommend that to you guys. This was an interesting look at that decision to stop at the Elbe and let the Russians go ahead and roll on into Berlin. If you're a World War II buff, I highly recommend it. And if you're not, I still recommend it. I thought it was a very interesting read. So, BookTube, I hope this little book chat helped you out in deciding to read Eisenhower and Berlin, 1945. So I hope everyone's having a great day. And until next time, happy reading.